Hello, everybody. I will wait till everybody gets the notification to head on over here. We had some talking going on earlier. I don't know how many of you are still in here. I know Charlotte, James, Cherry was in here early. Ray J. How is everyone today? Hi, Sam. Also, I want to give a shout out to my two lovely donors yesterday. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I love you guys. I will pay all of you guys a nice thank you because I'm probably going to be redoing the Shanghai Jewish refugees video this week. I'll start redoing it. I am okay. I'm really tired. I still have I took a shower, but I still have yesterday's makeup on. Hi, Sam. Cherry. Oh, God. It looks terrible. I got most of it off, but that was a lot of pigmented makeup. Okie dokie. So, let's start. So, according to the new cultural narrative, the ancient purity of the divine land had in fact been corrupted by external agents in the form of Confucianism and Buddhism. Slavish adherence to an alien culture had only served to obscure the true Wakan, the Japanese spirit or soul, and thus deprive Japan of its rightful position as a world order. Hi, Talana. Meiji Japan's promotion of religious nationalism in the form of state Shinto, which is what I talked about last week. I need to talk about that. State Shinto and religious nationalism. That is very dangerous when you start making a state religion. The form of state Shinto and its ideology of the family state, united under the divine emperor's father, helped solidify the notion of the distinct and homogeneous Japanese people and unique Japanese culture, which is funny because 80% of their culture is borrowed from China. The pressure of Western imperialism exacerbated the nationalism and racial exceptionalism, as expressed in the newspaper Nihon. If a nation wishes to stand among the great powers and preserve its national independence, it must strive always to foster nationalism. If a nation lacks patriotism, how can it hope to exist? Patriotism has its origin in the distinction between we and they, which grows out of nationalism, and nationalism is a basic element in preserving and developing a unique culture. Racism against Koreans blossomed in the first half of the 20th century with colonial subjugation and an influx of Korean labor into Japan. Colonialization both needed and helped foster a view of the colonialized as less civilized, as an inferior race in need of guidance from a racially pure Japan. As Takekoshi Yosaburo wrote, the Koreans can be slowly and gradually led into direction of progress, but it is against all laws of sociology and biology to make them enter a new life all at once. As with Western colonialism, the benevolent embrace of Japanese colonialism included fear of racial mixing and violent fear of violent resistance. After the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, for instance, 6,000 Koreans were massacred because of groundless rumors they had started riots. The racism remains useful today. In 2005, two manga became runway bestsellers, Hating the Korean Wave and Introduction to China. In the former, readers and protagonists come to understand both that South Korea cheated in the World Cup and it owes its contemporary successes to Japanese colonialism. The latter denies imperial war crimes and depicts China as a prostitution superpower, obsessed with cannibalism. Discussing such cultural phenomena as a symptom of national insecurity, historian Yutaka Yoshida claims of contemporary Japan, lacking confidence, they need a story of healing. Yeah, Japan really, I don't know much. The interesting thing about Korea is technically such a new superpower, and it modernized fairly late in comparison to other countries. An interesting thing I found out is a lot of Korean food is pickled because after the Korean War, there wasn't a lot of refrigerators, so they had to pickle a lot of their food, so that's why a lot of their food is pickled or whatever. But that's how recent their country came into finding itself. So it's our program at my school is Japanese and Chinese culture, and there isn't a lot of history books out there about Korea necessarily, a lot of studies because it's so new. But now that more people, I think one good thing about K-pop, even if you don't like it or you you do, is that it's bringing so much Korean culture into the spotlight that people are becoming interested. And that's why there's not a lot of like, you can get Korean classes at like the top universities, but like I took Korean class at the Korean Cultural Center in Chicago, and they said that their program was originally started for Korean children that were adopted that wanted to get more in tune with their heritage. But since the start of K-pop, so many people are signed up for their classes that it's insane. So I think, hi, Sasha. I think that's like a good thing to like, K-pop is good at bringing that into the forefront, their culture. So I think there's going to be a lot more writings and books on Korea itself and how their culture became formed, because a lot of the books you find is like, oh, Korea in terms of the Korean War, this and that. It's not much like the cultural beginning of Korea, like before they were invaded by Japan and that stuff. There's not a lot of information on that that's been published yet. That's at least from my understanding. Best to find out about K-pop, YouTube. I should start a list. I have a music list on my playlist section of my YouTube that should have some stuff. For the men I talk to, even all of this, the racism, the military training, the commitment to total obedience, the release into stressful combat conditions, even all this was not enough to make them into murderers, to make the atrocities possible. Kaneko-san describes some of their first experiences killing unarmed civilians. And so our superiors thought, these soldiers have to be trained in killing people. And so when we would enter a village, they would bring over some villagers, about 10. They would bring 10 or 15 of them. They would tie them up to trees. And after a while, 10 or so of us would stand in front of the trees in a long line. And we were holding rifles. We held our rifles, and in here, we'd stuck bayonets, right? Draw your blade, whip it out, stick it in here, and then stand in front of them, and then you guys kill those Chinese civilians, is the order we received. Then we charged in, and we aimed for the left part where the heart is. But we did not think our first time killing someone would be such a scary experience. Everyone was trembling with fear. Trembling. If you fought one-on-one, you have to kill your opponent or yourself will be killed, right? Then we do it as though in a dream. However, our opponents were tied to trees. So although it was easy to kill them, we were actually trembling with fear. My opponent was bound to a tree, just staring at my face. I aimed at that place, and then I went in and stabbed in the left part of the chest. But after hitting, my hand slipped. I did, like this. But since it was so terrifying, my hand slipped. And when that happened, only this much went into him. When I did this, there was a high-ranking instructor soldier who specialized in training us soldiers, And he said, "Are you fighting like a soldier of Japan?" Dirtbag, and raised his hand, and he smacked me. I couldn't do it even once, and most guys, everybody, they wouldn't stick them with their bayonets. Since they couldn't go in the end, some old soldier would say, "All right, you scum, watch me do it then." And with that, he gave us an example to follow. And when he did that, he did it like so. With that half, you see, the blade, he held the blade like this and just thrust it in. And after that, normally after you go in, you have your ribs right here, right? If you compare the width of the ribs and the width of the blade is wider. When you go like that, the blade doesn't go in. But the old soldiers would push until the blade was partway in, and then just like that. They turn the blade like this. When you do that, the blade gets thinner. You see? You do that, and the blade tip slips right in. That's the sort of training we received. Hi, Black Sheep. A lot of people choose to adopt from Korea. It's really weird, Ray. It's basically like shopping for children. Kaneko-san and the others emphasize that you must build towards cruelty patiently. It takes time to take men who tremble at the thought of killing and turn them into people who are eager for it. Take men who can't even hold their bayonets without shaking and turn them into men who can calmly and deftly twist the blade to slip it in, just the right way through the rib cage. You must methodically humiliate the victims until you see them like they deserve humiliation. In other words, the mortification of the enemy during wartime. Non-lethal practices like ransacking homes or beating and verbally abusing people are not accidents or mistakes or things that somehow get out of hand. They are deliberate parts of the training process. A person who has been shamed, starved, hurt, beaten, or humiliated begins to seem pitiful, begins to seem like she deserves to be shamed, starved, hurt, beaten, or humiliated. It makes it much easier to kill her. Psychologists explain this process through the just world hypothesis. That is, the stress of distrusting our environments is too much to bear over time. Our daily Psychic equilibrium depends upon assuming that the world is basically safe and just. When we see outrageous and apparently senseless suffering, this just world assumption is threatened. To deflect the anxiety such moral destabilization causes, we convince ourselves that the sufferer must have done something to deserve her lot. The world, after all, is just. Simone de Beauvoir provides a frightful example. Those who have done it say that it's easy to walk on a corpse and still easier to walk over a pile of corpses. In Algeria, I have seen any number of colonialists appease their conscience by the contempt in which they held the Arabs who were crushed with misery. The more miserable the latter were, the more contemptible they seemed, so much so that there was never any room for remorse. Perpetrator regimes must systematically remove the conditions for remorse. Brutality, of course, isn't only or always a consequence of indoctrination, training, or intention. It is also intention. It is also situational, a consequence of stress, rage, and fear. It is a consequence of the now. And seminal analysis of PTSD in Vietnam, Jonathan Shea describes the shocks that can precipitate a soldier's berserk state: betrayal, insult, or humiliation by a leader, death of a friend in arms, being wounded, being overrun, surrounded, or trapped, seeing dead comrades who have been mutilated by the enemy. The impulse to violence, and even berserk violence, is a natural human response to a certain kind of stressor. But there is always also system and planning. Blame the victim, desensitize and combine professional incentives with a threat and punishment. Atrocity is a plot of incremental escalation. The Chukurin describes the process. Sakura-san. They made us watch and learn. They would stab at bodies until you couldn't make out the body, the form, anymore. Maybe 30, 20 people would stab all together, and we would observe. And when we went back to the troop, about half the people didn't eat. And me too, we didn't feel great, you know? And when you'd remember that, well, you were remembering the sight of the body. You couldn't eat your food. This is the truth. And then, you'd get used to it the first time, second time, third time, and by then you're used to it. So now you're thinking, I'll do this now and my record will improve. Now, there was something that they used to post when I was doing the Nanking incident. There was an article that I read that showed a picture of 2 Japanese soldiers next to 2 dead bodies, and it was giving the totals of the number of people that they beheaded that day, and that was published in Japanese newspapers. Oh yeah, Ollie London, Charlotte. We can talk about that later. Ollie London's an interesting one. So, yeah, they used to publish in papers the number of people they would decapitate as a sport in Japan. It was crazy. So this is a statement from Kaneko-san. Kaneko-san says, in the Japanese army, they don't hit the head, they hit the body. So just here, just right here, even if it swells just a little, just so you can't eat. And that's how they did it. They would never hit your head because then you'd get a bruise on your head. When we were fresh recruits, we would stab the chest like this. One of our fellow soldiers, "You guys, I can't do this," he'd cried out. However, that soldier, after a year had passed, he was killing without blinking an eye. After a year, when he did it, he'd just cry, wah, wah. He couldn't do it. And then he was beaten on the cheek about 10 times by an old soldier. Even then, he didn't do it. But after a year had passed, now, on the contrary, he would do it on his own. That's what's so terrible about the army, If you're not used to chopping off heads, you'd of course shake, right? Then you can't do more than cut off the head halfway. Then the Chinese person with his head chopped halfway thrashes about with pain. Sorry, they're like about to mow right here by my house. Then the Chinese person with his head chopped halfway thrashes about with pain. So, in the end, you stab them to death. They make you do it 2 times, 3 times. After they make you do it twice and 3 times, you'd get the knack and toughen up. Then, in one go, bam, the head goes rolling off, completely chopped off. You do it no problem. However, soldiers don't have Japanese swords. So what do you think they used to cut heads off? The interpreter says, no clue. Kaneko-san says, that officer cut off the head. We soldiers don't have Japanese swords, We say, we want to cut off heads. Let's do it together. And do you know the tool to cut straw? The tool for cutting straw, you get food for horses like this. The thing for, and it was unclear what he said. We take one of those, put the head like this, where you tie Chinese heads. Then 5 or 6 of us hold the person down and then, bam, cut off the head. That's how they toughen you up. Kubotera-san. says, if you dissipate an order at any rate, if you disobeyed an order on the battlefield, they'd say you got the death penalty. And then, well, even if you didn't get the death penalty, you'd be court-martialed and nobody would consider doing something dishonorable. Well, anyway, I was greedy to become private first class, so that was part of it too. If you disobeyed, your advance to a higher rank would come to a complete stop. I wanted to be promoted. Human beings are not straightforward, I think, and all sorts of things, complicated feelings come out. Eventually, they did things they couldn't believe. Kubatero-san says, it was this sort of gently rolling countryside, and far off in the distance, there were a lot of mountains. And when we went over there, it was because my platoon commander looked at them through binoculars and realized, there are people over there. So we hurried over, and then in this pit, there was a mother and child. And well, when I think about it, this was extreme cruelty. Because my platoon commander shouted, Private Kubatera, shoot them. I did not expect that, but I could not disobey a platoon commander's orders, so I shot them. Well, I really could not. I couldn't look at the child I'd shot or anything like that. Yeah, I quickly turned my back to it, and I didn't really know what happened until others went and checked everything out. This was cruel. The mother, finding a mother and a child and shooting the child, this was because it was so common, it's unthinkable. However, your platoon commander's order was His Majesty the Emperor's order, and that's how we were taught. Well, I obeyed and I pulled the trigger, but when I think about it now, this kind of cruel thing, even if I were to be killed, I wouldn't want to do it. In his essay, Torture, Auschwitz survivor Jean Amory talks about the first blow. The first blow brings home to the prisoner that he is helpless, and thus it already contains in the bud everything that it is to come. If the expectation of help, the certainty of help, is one of the fundamental experiences of human beings, then Amory continues, I am certain that with the very first blow that descends on him, he loses something he will perhaps temporarily call trust in the world. I know that there is something very wrong with making this comparison, but it seems to me nonetheless that something similar is true for he who becomes a perpetrator. The first blow that he gives is the beginning of the end of the world. Because I joined the army, Kubatero-san said, I lost my humanity. I guess this is this is like an excerpt for a book. Of course, all kinds of people were needed in the resistance. There was one German Jewish student who had taken some art courses in Berlin. She didn't work with us on hiding children, but she was great at falsifying documents. And sometimes doing nothing is doing something. When I was transporting a really Jewish-looking boy or girl, no one on the train said a thing, though they knew exactly what was happening. That was helping with the resistance, too. Then again, there were people like this one couple. I invited them to join our group, and the girl said, you must look at this in a more astral way. Try to imagine that you are far off in the stars, and that you then look down from there on what goes on here. I had no time to argue. I said, you can just go burst, and walked off. Sometimes people wouldn't tell me, the Germans are unstoppable. Whatever you do won't matter. I answered, it will matter to the children that we save. That was an excerpt from Hetty Voigt in The Heart Has Reasons. This next part is an excerpt from Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Fears and Solitude. We, this whole people, have been clamorous for war and bloodshed, animating sports, the which we pay for as a thing to talk of, spectators and not combatants. Hi, Mickey. Oh, I'm reading this book called Evil Men about war atrocities in Japan and how we think about and process those. I've been talking about the perpetrator, his peer group, and the authority structure surrounding him. But for violence to be extensive over space and durable over time, it needs many concentric rings of support. Massacres would not be possible without a massive population of collaborators who are not directly involved, which is important. A massive amount of collaborators who are not directly involved. That is an underlinable point. You need the workers and the bureaucrats who maintain the institutions that produce the violence. And you need the bystanders, generally the civilian population at large, who do nothing more than wave a national flag or anti-war banners, like supporters of a competing football teams. I think We would call that in today's culture keyboard warriors. The astonishing passivity of bystanders in the face of outrageous suffering has been the subject of much study. Researchers emphasize diffusion of responsibility, a term used to explain an infamous 1964 incident in which a young woman named Kitty Genovese was murdered while an entire New York neighborhood watched and listened, each person assuming that someone else would take an action. Ooh, that's an interesting case. Did you guys hear about that case? About that woman in New York who was murdered and nobody did anything? I should do a little thing on that. Kitty. Murder. I write all over my books. I'm just going to have to get rid of this book thing. Hi, Valley Girl. Okay. The New York neighborhood watched and listened, each person assuming that someone else would take action. Confusion, when we cannot conceive an effective intervention or information is uncertain or complex, we respond with passivity. Expert culture, as Staub writes, everywhere people tend to accept a definition of reality provided by experts, their government, or their culture. And I can never say this. Pluralistic ignorance. People hide their reactions and emotions in public and then look to others to see what an appropriate emotional response is, seeing little or no concern in the public actions of others who are also hiding their emotions. They decide there may be no reason for concern after all. This last psychological pattern has a parallel at the level of national politics. As Samantha Powers explains, it is in the realm of domestic politics that the battle to stop genocide is lost. American political leaders interpret society-wide silence as an indicator of public indifference. Kind of what's happening with the genocide that's going on in China right now. So, China's up to some stuff, and I'm also going to be doing a series, I think, or I'm going to be looking into it. There was two interesting headlines that hit me the other day when I was reading the news. One was an opinion piece called The New Cold War, China and the United States, and the other one said that China is thinking of invading Taiwan, and that would cause World War III. So if you think that what happens in Asia doesn't pertain to you, you're wrong, because China possibly going to war with Taiwan would get almost the entire world involved just over an island that has it's like crazy. Yeah, with the Uyghur population, Mickey. Yep. I'm glad you knew, and you knew how to spell it. However, while passivity, distraction, and ignorance can prevent helpful interventions, they are often not sufficient to generate direct aggression. To move your people to kill or to actively support killing by proxy, you need generalized social anxiety, over economic crisis, for instance, to be publicly re-narrated as a specific fear. Such fear is distressingly easy to manufacture. Thomas Hobbes saw fear as a basic force underlying the social contract. He writes, and from this difference of one another, there is no way for any man to secure himself, so reasonable as anticipation, that is, by force or wiles, to master the person of all men he can, so long, till he sees no other power great enough to endanger him. Or as the Athenian generals declare to justify their destruction of Melos, and I can never say Greek names, of Melos and Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War. You and everybody else, having the same power as we have, would do the same as we do. But as Daniel Cheeritt and Clark Macaulay put it in Why Not Kill Them All? Fear comes in many forms, and the most excessive violence requires a particular combination: simple fear and fear of pollution. Simple fear that you will be injured as a group, creates a pliable public. Fear of pollution, the sentiment that a particular group is so polluting that its very presence creates a mortal danger, creates a potentially genocidal one. Ooh, that's a good one too. Sorry. Yeah, Christian groups are under attack as well. To maintain violence over long stretches of time, distance, euphemism, and censorship are also required. Distance can be in physical space or in a casual chain. With violence support staff, for instance, there are usually several layers separating the actions of the individual from unimaginable injuries. My father was an engineer from the Department of Defense. He is one of the most decent men I have ever known and would certainly never hurt anyone. He managed the personnel who maintained valves on U.S. nuclear submarines. No isolated action he ever performed in his job could be considered morally objectionable. He is now remembered in his community as a wonderful father, a kind and supportive supervisor, and a man who helped maintain a deterrent system that guaranteed U.S. security for a time. Had his submarines used their weapons and started a nuclear holocaust, he would have been remembered differently. He is morally lucky. Censorship and euphemism, censorship writ small, are just as important as distance. If civilian populations were forced to name accurately all the events of war, the emotional cost would quickly become unbearable. We simply cannot talk every day about burned skin and corpses piled high. Instead, we make metaphors, Coolidge writes, all are dainty terms for fratricide. Terms which trundle smoothly o'er our tongues, like mere abstractions, empty sounds to which we join no feeling and attach no form. Coleridge presents a poetic thought experiment to reveal the astonishing psychic power of these trivially familiar, trundling terms. What if all avenging providence, strong and retributive, should make us know the meaning of our words, force us to feel the desolation and the agony of our fierce doings? The cumulative weight of such agony and sudden revelation would be shattering. Most of the Uyghurs are Muslim because the Christians aren't allowed. The only religion that's really allowed to practice in China is Catholicism, just because the heads of the church, the Catholic Church in China, are picked by the government, and then some small sects of Judaism are allowed to go on in Shanghai, at least from my knowledge. So daily, we use sanitizing language that allows us to name injury without imagining it, or rather, to imagine it as patiently thoughtful and work-like. The 1946 atomic bomb tests on Bikini Atoll were carefully named Operation Crossroads, a largely successful public relations decision that conveyed an appropriate sense of caution, care, and awe. The name also turned gaze away from painful images of radiation casualties towards abstract visions of the development of humanity itself. Do they have to mow right next to my window? Less subtly, the multi-year campaign of herbicidal warfare in Vietnam, in which millions of gallons of Agent Orange were sprayed over nearly 20% of the forest land to destroy crops and cover, causing hundreds of thousands of cancers, birth defects, and stillbirths, along with enduring toxic hotspots and massive refugee flows into urban areas, was given the patiently rugged, earth-tending name Operation Ranch Hand. I actually went to school. I went to school at Hope College in Holland, Michigan. That one of the buildings was the building that the gym was in was actually named after one of the company that made Agent Orange. I can't remember it. What was it called? I gotta look it up now. Hope College gym. It was called the Dow Center. Yes, the Dow Center at Hope College is what was the school that I went to, and the Dow was named after Dow Chemical, which made Agent Orange. I mean, I believe that there's some racism against whites. I mean, there's a lot of, that's a different topic, but there can be. In the U.S., Gulf Wars, the most widely and instantly covered wars in human history, language and image management were at the very center of the battle strategy. They provide numerous examples of war imagined as work-like, playful, and even healthful. Our surgical strikes were not only clean, but sounded like healing. When they softened up the enemy, they sounded like acts of gentle persuasion. Cleaning out pockets of resistance, or mopping up the resistance, provided both the domestic satisfaction of tidying up and the predatory provocation of imagining the enemy as filth. The death squads were cleaned out and mopped up in Iraq, sounded like zombies were already dead anyway. Combat by ways of gaming metaphors, entering the red zone, rolling the dice, Operation Flea Flicker, Operation Triple Play, allow the public to repetitively experience the fantasy that combat is low stakes, that its injuries are minor, and then it ends with the clarity and finality of a football or baseball game. No blowback, no quagmire, and having reporters embedded, sounding fantastically democratic and inclusive, promoting an access to truth unlike anything we might have gotten from reporters who were, in other words, simply assigned. The names of campaigns are arguments in disguise. Sometimes they work. Desert Storm, for instance, helped eliminate any lingering doubts and anxieties that could have hindered the war effort. A hesitant President George H.W. Bush, deeply uncertain about what to do with the defiant Saddam Hussein, needed language that carried the force of natural fate, that simultaneously conveyed total conviction and avoided any traces of rash human aggression. The idea of the storm was perfect. A storm chooses you. It is impossible to avoid. But at the same time, if you are safely housed, it can be a thrilling spectacle to passively witness. And a desert storm is even better. It is inevitable working out of the enemy ecosystem. Sometimes, however, things don't go as planned. George W. Bush's shock and awe campaign in the Second Gulf War failed as language. It promised something it couldn't deliver. In the gap it left between promise and reality, it commemorated war's true shock. That grand word will always seem cheap next to spilled blood. In the invasion of Iraq, the early use of language celebrating U.S. military ferocity, helping and getting soldiers pumped up, as Brigadier General Sean McFarland said, over time began to give way to more pacific language designed to win over civilian populations on both sides. Hence the astonishing shift from shock and awe to years later, Operation Glad Tidings of Benevolence and Operation Together Forward. This pattern of rhetorical de-escalation recalls a similar shift in the Korean War, in which public revulsion over Operation Killer forced a change in naming strategies. Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway, responsible for the hated nickname along with Operation Ripper, responded to the criticism he received with barely constrained contempt. I am not convinced that the country should not be told that war means killing. I am by nature opposed to any effort to sell war to people as an only mildly unpleasant business that requires very little in the way of blood. Ridgway's clarifying frankness contrasts sharply to Lyndon Johnson's frustrated reaction during the Vietnam War to the name Operation Masher, which Johnson felt inappropriately underemphasized pacification. As General William Westmoreland put it, Johnson was upset that the connotation of violence provided a focus for carping war critics. Look back as far as the U.S. Civil War memories of General Sherman and Grant, and you will see the same sanitizing strategies and distorting verbal reflexes. Our flank was damaged, or we delivered a message, not 10 of thousands of soldiers died, or we shelled a civilian neighborhood. But sometimes more severe linguistic coercion is required. Sometimes it is necessary to stop people from talking altogether. Abraham Lincoln's restrictions upon free speech were notoriously unflinching and persuasive. Just so, Japan's 20th century wartime political rearrangements included the newspaper and publication control ordinance, the press, publications, assembly, and association special control law, and an expansion of the peace preservation law that regulated subversive thought and behavior. Over 70,000 were arrested under this law from 1928 to 1941. We have strengthened our control, declared Prime Minister Tojo in 1941, over those who are anti-war and anti-military, such as communists, rebellious Koreans, certain religious leaders, and others who fear may be a threat to the public order. So anybody that opposed war, the press was arrested, and about 70,000 people were arrested. So it was very hard to get any mindset about anything. So people were really into the state Shinto nationalism that they were pressing. Discussing Argentina's dirty war, Marguerite Fitilowitz tracks the systemic damage violent regimes inflict on communication. I have come to believe that, even after the regime has ended, language may be the last system to recover. Jacobo Timmerman, a journalist arrested and tortured by the military, Juanita, describes the great silence that appears in every civilized country that passively accepts the inevitability of violence. Discussing Mao Zedong's China, Lifton epitomizes the social damage of censorship and the idea of the thought-terminating cliche, language that prepares us for violence because it reduces complex problems to simple ultimate terms. God and devil, good and evil, that which must be cultivated and that which must be eliminated. in art finally explains that violent regimes must sustain themselves through language rules. For what other reasons the language rules have been devised, she writes of the Holocaust, they proved of enormous help in the maintenance of order and sanity in the various widely diversified services whose cooperation was essential in this matter, and the paradigmatic instances of art, later chillingly called defactualization. Nazis redescribed liquidation, and killing as evacuation. So instead of saying we were killing Jews, they would say we evacuated Jews, and that would get more of the public on their side. Change of residence and resettlement. Claude Lanzmann's documentary film of the Holocaust, Shoah, reveals the logic of Nazi atrocities. Violence starts in secrecy and silence, and it perpetuates such silence as part of its very nature. The film, composed of interviews with witnesses, survivors, and perpetrators, continually points back to the Holocaust's shattering of language as its primary enabling condition and also its legacy. No, I was talking about making nationalism in the sense of like people Japan started like this wide campaign of like state Shinto and like nationalism and stuff that they were, it's like kind of it's a different thing to talk about. It's something we discussed earlier. Okay. So in this book it says no one can describe it, and let's not talk about that. Anyone who uttered the words corpse or victim was beaten. It is impossible to say anything. We were just like stoned. We were not allowed to talk to each other or to express our views or our minds to each other. Resettlement program. No one ever spoke of killing. You had to take an oath. No, just sign, promising to shut up about whatever we'd see. Well then, the word got around. When it was whispered, it was never said outright. Good God, no. They'd haul you off at once. And the key to the entire operation from a psychological standpoint was never to utter the words that would be appropriate to the action being taken. Say nothing. Do these things. Do not describe them. If you lie enough, you believe your own lies. I don't think the human tongue can describe the horror we went through in the ghetto. And that was like a little bit of the words from that book that I was just talking about. Oh, it's okay, Mickey. It's hard to avoid talking about Nazis, but I wish I could. They are such exotic evil. They have nothing to do with us. Nobody reads the paragraph above and says, for instance, yes, that's what it felt like watching as anti-war voices were stigmatized and marginalized in the first heavy days of the Gulf War. Or, yes, that's what it felt like watching television under the U.S. media coffin ban. Or, yes, that's what it felt like watching videos of smart bombs blowing up empty bridges and buildings. Or, yes, that's what it felt like hearing suicide attempts by detainees at Guantanamo described as manipulative, self-injurious behavior. Nobody thinks such things, and nobody should. At some deep level, Nazis allow for what Albert Bandura calls exonerating comparison, and perhaps they also prohibit comparison. In the paragraph just above on censorship, for instance, I wanted to talk about My Lai massacre, but wasn't comfortable fitting it next to the Holocaust. Here's what I wanted to say. My Lai will follow at a distance. Censorship isn't only somebody else stopping you from receiving troubling information. It's you not permitting yourself to understand troubling information you receive. Study after study reveals that we are relatively awful users of information, and that our errors tend to close us off to others. We see our own negative actions as a result of our situation, and see the negative actions of others as a result of their nature. Actor-observer bias. We like familiar things just because they are familiar. Mere exposure effect, and we perceive diversity in our own communities, but think of members of other communities as all the same. Out-group homogeneity bias. We think especially poorly when we think together. We tend to adopt more extreme opinions in groups than we would alone. Group polarization. Become more competitive with other groups than we would alone. Discontinuity effect, and make riskier decisions than we would when alone. Risky shift effect. In groups, we prefer easy solutions to good ones. Satisficing. We do things just because everybody else is doing them. Information cascade. We focus on information we already share at the expense of new information held by a few. Shared information bias. And when we're listening to each other, we simplify what we hear, reductive coding, exaggerate differences in order to clear distinctions, enhancement of contrast, focus on the beginnings and endings, middle message loss, reinterpret messages so that they match previous ones, assimilation to prior input, and reinterpret messages so that they match what we anticipated hearing, assimilation to expected message. Oh, that's interesting. I'm going to have to look those up. Oh my God, how much have we read so far? See, I'm sorry I'm not like active with the chat, but I like how much people are chatting behind each other. That's what this is for. We're getting there. On top of all that, we pay more attention to negative information than positive information. Negativity bias. Focusing on threats over signs of safety. Remembering bad experiences more intensely than good ones. Giving more weight to negative information about strangers than positive information. Experiencing our dislike of bad behavior in others more intensely than our liking of their good behavior. And forming negative stereotypes about others more quickly and with less data than we do forming positive stereotypes. This gets worse when we are anxious or insecure. In those emotional states, we are even more likely to stereotype others, to show in-group favoritism, to judge members of our group as possessing better features than those of other groups, to engage in downward social comparison, focusing on worse off others to comfort ourselves, and subsequently to remember negative rather than positive things about those handy worse off others. Finally, we seek out information that confirms our existing beliefs while filtering out information that challenges them, confrontation bias, and we seek cognitive consistency at sometimes unbearable costs. Denying even the plainest revealed truths of accepting them would require us to give up, with pain, previously cherished belief. Cognitive dissonance. Ooh, that's an interesting one. I know, cognitive dissonance. Do you ever hold that? Is kind of interesting because do you ever hold a belief that was so cherished or so pushed into you when you were a child that even if you found out about how you might not, you find out facts about it that makes it not true, when you get older, you have a hard time letting go of that belief? Kind of like, I kind of struggle with that. Like when you think, like, I went to church a lot when I was little, and my grandma used to push Christianity in my head. And then when I grew up and began to like think of things differently and learn about facts and science, then I'm like, I know it's true, but then I can't drop that little Catholicism stuff that they pushed in me because it's such a cherished belief from my grandmother. So I'm like chasing pop with coffee. As its extreme, we call this cluster of cognitive patterns denial of reality. In the My Lai massacre, Jonathan Glover notes, U.S. soldiers crouched in defensive firing positions when shooting fleeing children, as if to persuade themselves they are in combat situations for facing armed soldiers. As one soldier described it afterwards, if you're actually thinking in terms of a massacre or murder, going in and shooting such a bunch of defenseless people, why crouch? Because your judgment is all screwed up. They actually look like the enemy, or what you think is the enemy. U.S. soldiers in My Lai had reason to be scared of enemies, but not just scared then, with those families. I think the United States is in a similar situation now and has been for a long time. We are a culture crouched into a defensive firing position. I'm going to read for like another 10 minutes. Whew. We were on page 63, now we're on page 81. So we are back to Ibato-san. But they'll make it so you respond reflexively to the orders of those above you, like a robot or slave. You could say that training, those sorts of people, was what Japanese recruit training was. And other than this corporal punishment was this bullying. And this was endlessly. For instance, there was the punishment we called young lady. Another one was called nightingale crossing the valley. And in this, you'd crawl through the bed calling out like a nightingale. Then the old soldiers would say things like, good Lord, the nightingales sound awful this year, and go on and on. They thought out endless punishments and ways to abuse the new guys. This was the recruitment training, and the result of all this, well, the individual personality was completely killed, and you follow only your superior's orders. That kind of robot, that that could on the battlefield, if the order came down from the superior, kill the other races with cool and composure. Everybody would wind up that way. So to become a person without ideas, without thoughts, that your body would do in a flash what you're told, you would say we became the sort of person. So we went to the army, and as I said earlier, by things like the new recruit being killed on the battalion commander's orders, and body trained by the recruit training would simply jump over one's reason, and then you'd commit the crime. In the end, it's like what you ask. It becomes pleasurable. For instance, you'll shut them up in a house, set fire to it, and watch it burn. That's sort of unbelievably gruesome, brutal pleasure. Veteran William Broyles Jr. calls war a terrible ecstasy, explaining that its fundamental allure is the passion to witness, to see things, what the Bible calls the lust of the eye, and the Marines in Vietnam calling eye fucking. J. Glenn Gray, veteran of an earlier U.S. war, describes combat as a matter of aesthetic delight and the experience of the sublime. War, again, is the lust of the eye. It involves delight and destruction. For some, it becomes a consuming lust which swallows up other pleasures, turning men inward upon themselves and making them inaccessible to more normal satisfactions. Some psychologists use what is called the opponent process theory to account for the development of this kind of sadism. The theory holds that whenever a body is excited out of its normal state, an internal process must follow to return its equilibrium. Baumeister and Campbell describe the dramatic effect that repetition has on his own cycle. The initial departing, the process A, response is often strong at first, whereas the restorative B process is relatively inefficient. But over time, through many similar experiences, the B process becomes increasingly efficient and powerful, whereas the A process becomes weaker. In effect, the B process comes to dominate. This description sounds arcane, but in the common sense, and we have all experienced it, as Baumeister and Campbell explain, it is a principle of physical exercise. For instance, the runner's high. The first time you run to exhaustion, you feel sick. Your body will recover only gradually, and the pleasure of escaping from the distress state will be weak. If you do it more, however, the more workout will become less distressing. The process A weakens, and the escape from the distress will become more and more pleasurable. The B process dominates. You will eventually crave running. Christopher Brownings describes how the men of Nazi Germany's Reserve Police Battalion 101 were, after their first massacre, depressed, angered, embittered, and shaken. He writes, "They ate little but drank heavily. Generous quantities of alcohol were provided, and many of the policemen got quite drunk. Major Trapp made the rounds, trying to console and reassure them, and again placing responsibility on higher authorities. But neither the drink nor Trapp's consolation could wash away the sense of shame and horror that pervaded the barracks. However, over time, the horrors of the initial encounter eventually became routine, and the killing became progressively easier. In a sense, brutalization was not the cause, but the effect of these men's behavior. Applying opponent process theory to these kinds of atrocities, Baumeister and Campbell's write that euphoria would be the body's most effective antidote to the severe disgust and distress caused by hurting others. Acquiring a taste for violence is a gradual process. Discussing the terror, yeah, maybe using the religious one was a little bit of a not good example, because what my truth is, to some people that's true and that's okay and that's great for them, but that might not be true to me. So I guess I shouldn't have described that as fact, but that was like an example. So for some people it's true religion, and that could be all great and dandy, believe what you want. But for me, it's not all true. I'm more spiritual, I guess. So as long as you guys noticed that, I was able to point that out. So that's good. Acquiring a taste for violence is a gradual process. Discussing the terror of combat and the Sunni Triangle, ambushes, roadside bombs, civilian casualties. One U.S. veteran puts it this way: "It was the oddest feeling. The only way to describe that kind of combat is that it's like being raped, but really enjoying it. It scares you. It's horrible, but at the same time, you start to like it. But even though the process of acclimatization to violence is slow, and any given episode, even in the first episodes, violence can accelerate quickly once it begins. Those same depressed and reluctant men Browning describes above self-amplified that very first night. As darkness approached, the shooting became even less organized and more hectic. The emotional arousal of violence is, as Zimbardo writes, upward spiraling, describing how women in his shock experiment increased the amount of electricity they delivered as the trial continued. He explains, the agitated behavior became self-reinforcing, each action stimulating a stronger, less controlled next reaction. But this behavior is not evidence of sadism, argues Zimbardo. Not exactly. It comes instead, he postulates, from energizing sense of one's domination and control over others at the same moment in time. Jacobo Timmerman, imprisoned by the Argentine military in 1970s, saw in his torturers a pathological need for such domination. The torturer, he writes, needs to be needed by the tortured. He explains further, the conversion of dirty, dark, gloomy places into a universe of spontaneous innovation and institutional beauty is one of the most arousing pleasures for torturers. It is as if they felt themselves to be masters of the force required to alter reality, and it places them again in the world of omnipotence. This omnipotence, in turn, they feel assures them of impunity, a sense of immunity to pain, guilt, or emotional imbalance. William Schultz sees this craving for omnipotence, this need for the need of others, as deeply universally human. A Unitarian Universalist minister and the former executive director of Amnesty International USA, Schultz recalls discovering these cruel pleasures in himself as a child when he abused a dog. It was fascinating to feel like this little creature so entirely under my control, he writes. Violence is energizing and fascinating. It releases us from feeling the repetition and boredom of life. And this way, it is a natural cousin to pranks and thrilling diversions. Violence also wakes up for all the awful moments in our lives when we felt small and weak and helpless. Virtue can be satisfying, but it smacks of obedience. Violence, by contrast, is freedom. It liberates us from restraints and duties that hold us close each moment of our day. In The Thin Red Line, James Jones describes the thrill Private Dahl experiences when he first kills an enemy Japanese soldier. It was like a first sexual encounter. Dahl thinks it makes him feel vastly superior. It had to do with guilt. Dahl felt guilty. He couldn't help it. He had killed a human being, a man. He had done the most horrible thing a human could do, worse than rape even. And nobody in the whole damn world could say anything to him about it. That was where the pleasure came. Wait, what, where? What, Mickey? I'm the same, Sam. In its extreme, the emancipating moral alienation of violence can be transcendent, even ecstatic. As one Soviet soldier said of his time in Afghanistan, we will never walk or make love or be loved the way we walked and were loved over there. Everything was heightened by the closeness of death. Death hovered everywhere and all the time. Life was full of adventure. I learned the smelt of danger. We were homesick for it, some of us. It's called the Afghan syndrome. That violence is often associated with ecstatic experiences is seen in our own using the same phrases for both. Note psychologist Rollo May, we say a person is beside himself with rage. He is possessed by power. The combination described in these phrases, simultaneous self-escape and total absorption, is narcotic. It can also be, for many, sexual. All of the soldiers above, like other soldiers over the years, characterize the pleasure of battle in sexual terms. Sex and war, Christopher Hedges writes, is another variant of the drug of war. At the height of war, during the breakup of Yugoslavia, Hedges notes, Belgrade had 70 escort services, 3 adult cinemas, and 20 pornographic magazines. Radical change from the pre-war regime, which had banned pornography. Combat violence is linked together with sexual violence. Hedges calls rape a natural outcome of war. That's interesting. While men and boys are often victims of sexual violence in war, women are favored targets. Why do soldiers rape women? In fraternity gang rape, Peggy Sanday describes how the rituals of hazing that produce intense bonding in male social group depends upon contempt for women. The submersion of the self in the group is generated, in part, through a two-step process, produce anxiety in the individual by representing the feminine as both dirty and as part of his subjectivity, and then resolve that anxiety by cleansing the individual of his supposed feminine identification and promising him a lifelong position in a purified male social order. In a sense, the cruelty towards women recounted by Chukrin was not so much a result of an upward spiraling nature of violence as its cause, not so much the climax of accumulating violence as the originary moment that made it possible. If you combine a misogynistic hazing, bonding, and initiation process with a very real need to rely upon and entrust one another in order to survive, you get fraternal codependence that is unfathomably deep. When that codependence is combined with the shared alienation of incommunicable drama, it becomes world-defining. Siegfried Sassoon, the British poet and veteran of World War I, writes, "The man who really endured the war at its worst was everlastingly differentiated from everyone except his fellow soldiers. People will do almost anything to avoid expulsion from this brotherhood. This is what is the most difficult," a French soldier in Algeria said of his refusal to fight alongside his comrades. Being cut off from the fraternity, being locked in a monologue, being incomprehensible. But soldiers don't only kill for each other, they also die for each other. Anybody who looks at war fairly must acknowledge what this means. War works because of what the worst about us, our fear and weaknesses, and because of what's the best about us, our capacity to love something more than we love ourselves. Jonathan Shea, a staff psychiatrist for the Department of Veteran Affairs Outpatient Clinic in Boston, writes, "Of all groups in America today, military people have the greatest right to and will benefit most if they reclaim the word love as part of what they are, what they do." Reflecting upon his own experience of war, J. Glenn Gray writes, "Are we not right in honoring the fighter's impulse to sacrifice himself for a comrade, even though it be done as it so frequently is in evil cause? I think so. It is some kind of world historical pathos that the striving for union and for immortality must again and again be consummated, while men are in the service of destruction. I do not doubt for a moment that wars are made many times more deadly because of this striving and this impulse. Yet I would not want to be without the assurance their existence gives me that our species has a different destiny than is granted to other animals. Though we often sink below them, we can at moments rise above them too." Despite my discomfort with Gray's words in this passage, I feel myself reaching in sympathy towards the yearning he expresses for lives that transcend petty self-interest. Wars are born in love, and through this love we find meaning, even with its destruction and carnage. Hedge writes, "War can give us what we long for in life. It gives us purpose, meaning, and a reason for living." Whew, we'll end there today. We always end around an hour. We landed on page 88. And we don't have that many pages. Page 88, and we have to go to page 224. So we only have that much left to read. But this text is little, man. It's not small. I mean, it's a small book, but it's like front and back. Like, yeah, my mom just kind of was like, be what you want in religion. Be what you want. That's enough, like, smart stuff for one day. I hope you guys liked it. And I like that everybody's having conversations in the chat. That's interesting. I'd like that chats are active, even if I'm not being active with you guys. So I'm going to go. I was actually emptying out my closet, trying to get rid of some stuff. So I'm glad that everybody enjoyed the readings. So I'm going to say goodbye to Sam, Valley Girl, Cherry, Mickey, James, who else? Ray J. Dr. Doolittle. I think I got everyone. Oh my gosh, you guys chatted so much. I think I said everyone right. Charlotte was here. Cherry, Susan was here. I think that's everyone, right? Was that everyone that was here? Okay. If I forgot anybody, I'm sorry. Okay. Well, you guys all have a good day. And I will talk to you guys later. Bye. We'll have another one tomorrow. Okay? Love you guys. Bye. Bye-bye.